The destruction of the Dassler family happened in a single second. It was 1943. The Allied forces were bombing Herzogenaurach. Adolf Adi Dassler and his wife scrambled down into the family's shared concrete bunker, where his brother Rudolf was already hiding in the dark, trembling with fear. Adi spat out one sentence: "The dirty bastards are back again." He was talking about the bombers, but Rudolf, paranoid and consumed by 10 years of domestic hatred, knew better. He looked at his brother in the dim light and decided instantly, he is talking about me. He believed Adi was calling him and his family dirty bastards. That 5-word sentence was the point of no return. They walked out of the bunker alive, but the brothers were dead. From that moment on, they were enemies. How two wives started a war. The Dassler fratricide was a spatial crime before it was a political one. The brothers did not hate each other from a distance. They hated each other from a distance of 0 meters. The family villa in Herzogenaurach was an architectural monstrosity designed to destroy relationships. It was a large 3-story structure that functioned less like a home and more like a vertical prison block. Christoph and Paulina, the parents, occupied the ground floor, acting as the wardens. Rudolf and his family occupied the upper level. Adi and his family occupied the middle. This layout created a forensic nightmare known as enforced intimacy. They shared a single bathroom. They shared a single kitchen. They shared the laundry lines in the garden. There was no privacy. Every bodily function, every argument, every moment of weakness was audible to the entire clan. The walls were thin. When Rudolf shouted at his children, Adi heard it. When Käthe laughed, Friedel heard it. The villa became an acoustic echo chamber where minor irritations were amplified into existential threats. They could smell each other's cooking. They could hear each other's footsteps. This lack of territorial integrity triggered a primal biological aggression. Humans are territorial animals. By forcing 2 alpha males and their alpha wives into a single cage, the family created a sociological experiment guaranteed to end in violence. The equilibrium of this dysfunctional ecosystem was shattered in 1934. Adi Dassler committed the unforgivable sin of marrying an outsider. Käthe Martz was not from the insular, gossip-filled village of Herzogenaurach. She was from the Pirmasens region, a shoe manufacturing hub. She was distinct. She was elegant. She was undeniably sharper than anyone else in the house. Käthe did not enter the villa as a submissive daughter-in-law. She entered as a hostile takeover artist. She refused the role of the silent German Hausfrau. She demanded a seat at the table. She looked at the factory operations and saw inefficiency. She looked at Rudolf and saw a loudmouth who took credit for her husband's work. Her presence was a chemical shock to the system. Rudolf's wife, Friedel, was a local girl, quiet, traditional, and subservient. Friedel's entire identity was built on pleasing the matriarch, Paulina. Käthe's identity was built on power. The conflict between the women was total. It was a war of glances, whispers, and exclusions. Käthe viewed Friedel as a bovine peasant, a woman whose horizon ended at the kitchen stove. Friedel viewed Käthe as an arrogant interloper, a city woman who put on airs and disrespected the family traditions. They turned the domestic sphere into a battlefield. If Friedel hung her laundry in the sun, Käthe would complain it blocked the view. If Käthe cooked a roast, Friedel would complain about the smell. These were not petty grievances, they were proxy wars. Each woman was fighting for the soul of her husband. Käthe whispered into Adi's ear that he was being exploited. Friedel whispered into Rudolf's ear that he was being disrespected. The wives became the handlers of the 2 dogs, tightening the leashes and sharpening the teeth. Paulina Dassler, the mother, was the architect of the toxicity. In the forensic profile of the family, she exhibits the classic traits of triangulation. She did not love her sons equally. She adored Rudolf. Rudolf was extroverted, charming, and loud, a mirror of Paulina's own ambitions. She tolerated Adi. She viewed him as the worker bee, useful but uninspiring. But Paulina loathed Käthe. She saw Käthe's intelligence as a threat. A smart daughter-in-law is dangerous to a controlling matriarch. Paulina formed a strategic alliance with Friedel. Together they launched a campaign of psychological attrition against Käthe. They criticized her parenting methods. They mocked her fashion choices. They spoke in the local dialect when she was in the room to exclude her. They weaponized food, giving the choice cuts of meat to Rudolf and the scraps to Adi. Adi saw this. He felt the humiliation of his wife daily. But he was a man of pathological passivity in social situations. He retreated into the workshop. He hid behind his shoelace. This silence infuriated Käthe. She demanded defense. He gave her evasion. This dynamic forced Käthe to become harder, colder, and more aggressive to survive. She realized she was alone in enemy territory. She stopped trying to win Paulina's approval and started trying to destroy Paulina's favorite son. She decided that if she couldn't rule the house, she would rule the factory. The rise of the Third Reich provided the family with new, lethal ammunition. Politics in the Dassler house was not about ideology, it was about leverage. Both brothers joined the NSDAP in May 1933. This was standard for German businessmen wanting to survive, but their internal commitment was vastly different, and the wives exploited this gap. Rudolf was a true believer. He loved the pageantry, the uniforms, and the rhetoric of strength. It appealed to his vanity. He became a recognizable figure in the local party hierarchy. Adi was a pragmatist. He joined because the Wehrmacht needed boots. He cared about sports, not race laws. In the villa, Friedel used Rudolf's party status as a bludgeon. She implied that Rudolf was the patriot and Adi was the parasite. In the paranoid atmosphere of Nazi Germany, this was dangerous. To be insufficiently enthusiastic about the party was to invite scrutiny from the Gestapo. Friedel and Rudolf would host local Nazi officials at the villa, drinking and laughing late into the night. Käthe and Adi stayed upstairs silent. Rudolf began to view his brother's lack of political fervor as a personal insult and a potential business risk. He started to believe that Adi was soft. Käthe, conversely, saw Rudolf's political posturing as a liability that would eventually destroy the company. She documented his excesses. She noted his drunk talk. She was building a mental dossier long before the Americans arrived. The swastika flag flying outside their house was not just a symbol of the state, it was a symbol of the divide between the brother who wanted to march and the brother who wanted to work. The hatred was genetic. It passed through the umbilical cord. The children, Horst and Armin, were conscripted into the war before they could walk. The villa became a segregated zone for the cousins. They were forbidden from playing together. The mothers used the children as status objects. If Käthe dressed Horst in a new suit, Friedel would demand Rudolf buy Armin a better one. If Armin learned a new skill, Käthe would push Horst to outdo him. The cousins were taught to view the family on the other floor not as blood relatives, but as the enemy. They learned to interpret a smile from an uncle as a trap. Horst Dassler grew up in this toxic petri dish. He watched his mother, Käthe, maneuver against the combined force of Friedel and Paulina. He learned that survival meant manipulation. He learned that information was a weapon. He saw his father, Adi, bury his head in work while his mother fought the battles. This childhood formed the psychological bedrock of Horst's future career. He became the man who would later bribe FIFA officials and manipulate the Olympics because he had been raised in a house where bribery and manipulation were the only ways to get dessert. He didn't learn sportsmanship in Herzogenaurach. He learned total war. Beneath the screaming and the silence, a brutal economic reality festered. The factory was the only source of income for everyone. As the war approached, resources became scarce. Leather was rationed. Workers were drafted. The pressure on the business was immense. Keta Martz began to audit the family. She realized that Rudolf was an economic drain. He spent money on cars, on suits, on party functions. He was the face, but he consumed more than he produced. Adi and Keta were the engines of production. Keta began to resent that her husband's genius was funding Rudolf's lifestyle. She started to cut Rudolf out of the decision-making loop. She hid designs. She intercepted mail. She made unilateral decisions about raw materials. Rudolf felt this loss of control viscerally. He was the elder brother. By German tradition, he should be the leader, but he was being castrated by his sister-in-law. He saw Adi's silence not as passivity, but as complicity. He believed Adi and Keta were conspiring to steal his birthright, and he was right. They were. They had decided that the company could not survive two heads. One had to be cut off. The wives' war shifted from a battle for respect to a battle for survival. It became a zero-sum game. The villa was too small for two fortunes. By 1943, the silence in the villa was heavier than concrete. The families passed each other on the stairs like ghosts. They ate their meals in aggressive silence. The air was thick with unexpressed violence. The boiling point, as we saw, was the bunker incident in 1943. That single sentence, "The dirty bastards are back again," did not just echo off the concrete walls, it shattered the psychological foundation of the family. Rudolf didn't hear a comment about the Royal Air Force. Conditioned by years of domestic warfare, he heard a declaration of hate from his own brother. That moment in the dark confirmed what Rudolf had long suspected. Adi wasn't just his rival, he was his enemy. He believed Adi was using the bombing raid as an opportunity to curse him. This misunderstanding was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of the environment they had built. Trust was dead. Benefit of the doubt was dead. Logic was dead. Only the wives' war remained. Rudolf swore in that bunker that he would never forgive Adi. He believed Adi had brought bad luck, that Adi wanted him dead, that Adi was the enemy. When they climbed out of the bunker, the factory was still standing, but the family was rubble. The fracture was complete, sending a brother to prison. The Third Reich did not end with a bang in Herzogenaurach. It ended with the grinding of gears. On April 16, 1945, the tanks of the U.S. Third Army rolled into the cobbled streets of the village. For the Dassler family, the arrival of the Americans was not a liberation. It was a forensic audit of their survival instincts. The Nazi regime they had served for 12 years had evaporated overnight. The swastika flags were burned. The portraits of Hitler were buried in the garden. Now the brothers faced a new reality where their value was no longer measured by their loyalty to the party, but by their utility to the conquerors. The Dassler villa was immediately requisitioned. The American officers looked at the sprawling mansion on the hill and decided it would make a perfect headquarters. They moved in, boots muddy from the battlefield, displacing the family into the servant quarters and the gatehouse. This forced proximity to the enemy revealed the final fatal divergence between the brothers. Rudolf Dassler, the true believer, was paralyzed by the psychological collapse of his idol. He viewed the Americans with a mixture of fear and sullen resentment. He was a man whose entire identity was tied to a defeated ideology. He had no language for this new world. Adolf Adi Dassler, however, underwent an instant metamorphosis. Guided by the Machiavellian intelligence of his wife Kata, Adi realized that the Americans were not just soldiers, they were customers. He saw that they played baseball, he saw that they played basketball, he saw that they loved sports. Adi did not mourn the death of National Socialism. He immediately pivoted to the capitalism of the occupation. While Rudolf sat in the dark, stewing in his humiliation, Adi and Kata were in the kitchen, charming the officers. Kata Martz played the role of her life during these weeks. She understood that in the chaos of occupation, personal relationships were the difference between survival and imprisonment. She befriended the American commanders. She cooked for them. She facilitated their comfort in the villa. But the masterstroke was the shoe. Adi produced a pair of track spikes and presented them to a high-ranking officer. He explained through broken translation and pantomime that he was not a Nazi munition maker, but a humble shoemaker who had shod Jesse Owens in 1936. This was a brilliant act of historical editing. Adi conveniently omitted the years spent manufacturing the Panzerschreck anti-tank weapons in his factory. He omitted the French forced laborers. He presented himself as a man of science and sport, a victim of circumstance. The Americans, tired of war and eager for souvenirs, bought the lie. They loved the shoes. They loved the story of Jesse Owens. Adi became the shoemaker. He was useful. He could fix their boots. He could make gifts for them to send home. This charm offensive created a protective membrane around Adi and Kata. They were no longer enemies. They were local assets. Rudolf watched this transformation with disgusted disbelief. From his vantage point in the cramped quarters he had been banished to, he saw his brother serving drinks to the men who had bombed their town. He saw Kata laughing with the officers. To Rudolf's rigid, fanatical mind, this was treason. He saw it as proof of Adi's lack of spine, but forensically it was proof of Adi's superior adaptation. In the Darwinian environment of 1945, the rigid oak breaks, but the willow bends. Rudolf was the oak, rotting from the inside. Adi was the willow, bending toward the new source of light. The Americans were not just there to relax. They were there to purge. The Counterintelligence Corps began the process of denazification. They set up tribunals to identify, arrest, and punish high-ranking Nazi officials and war profiteers. The Dassler factory was a prime target. It had produced weapons. Both brothers were party members. The CIC opened a file on the Dassler brothers. The investigators began to ask questions around the town. Who was the real Nazi? Who ran the factory? Who treated the workers badly? In a small town like Herzogenaurach, information is currency, and the Dassler employees were eager to spend it. But the narrative that emerged was not random. It was curated. Kata Dassler had spent years building loyalty among the key foremen and administrative staff. Rudolf, with his loud mouth and imperious management style, had made enemies. The whispers that reached the ears of the CIC officers began to paint a specific picture. Rudolf was the ardent Nazi, the speechmaker, the true believer. Adi was the quiet craftsman who just followed orders to save his business. Rudolf sensed the net tightening. He was interrogated multiple times. He tried to defend himself by pointing out that Adi was also a member, that Adi ran the factory floor where the weapons were made. But his defense was frantic and aggressive, which only made him look more guilty to the Americans. They saw a loud, unrepentant German nationalist. When they looked at Adi, they saw a quiet, cooperative businessman. The bias was set, but the Americans needed a smoking gun. They needed a direct accusation from a credible source to justify a high-level arrest. The exact mechanism of the betrayal remains one of the dark mysteries of the dossier, but the timing is damning. In late July 1945, Rudolf was arrested by the American military police. This was not a routine questioning. They came for him with jeeps and rifles. They dragged him out of the house in front of his wife Friedel and his son Armin. He was handcuffed and thrown into the back of a truck, destined for the notorious internment camp at Hammelburg. Rudolf did not go quietly. As he was being hauled away, he looked back at the villa. He looked at the window where Adi and Käthe stood watching. In that moment, the paranoia that had been born in the bunker crystallized into a certainty. Rudolf knew he hadn't been arrested solely because of his party membership. Thousands of low-level members were left alone. He was arrested because someone had provided the CIC with a specific damaging dossier. Someone had told them that Rudolf worked for the Sicherheitsdienst or the Gestapo. Someone had painted him as a security threat. There was only one person with the motive and the knowledge to construct such a lie: his brother. Adi stood at the window, impassive. He did not intervene. He did not use his newfound friendship with the officers to plead for his brother's release. He let Rudolf go. Forensically, this inaction is as incriminating as the action itself. By allowing Rudolf to be removed from the equation, Adi achieved what the wives' war had failed to do for a decade. He secured sole control of the company. With Rudolf in a cage in Hammelburg, Adi was the undisputed king of the factory. The arrest was a hostile takeover disguised as political justice. The days following Rudolf's arrest were the quietest the villa had ever known. The loud, booming voice of the elder brother was gone. Friedel and her children were left isolated, terrified, and socially radioactive. Adi and Käthe did not offer comfort. They consolidated their power. They moved to secure the factory's assets, ensuring that the American contracts for baseball boots were signed in Adi's name. This period marks the transition of the conflict from a domestic feud to a criminal conspiracy. Adi's survival strategy relied on Rudolf being the bad Nazi. If both were guilty, the factory would be confiscated. If one was the villain and the other the victim, the factory could be saved. For the victim. Adi sacrificed his brother to the denazification machine to save the family inheritance. It was a cold, calculated amputation. Rudolf sat in the back of the truck, bouncing over the cratered roads of Germany, heading towards starvation and disease in the camp. He had plenty of time to think. He thought about the bunker, he thought about the insults, but mostly he thought about the window. He realized that the war was not over. The World War had ended, but the Dassler War had just begun. He vowed that if he ever got out of Hammelburg alive, he would not just build shoes. He would build a weapon to destroy Adolf Dassler. The Judas betrayal had been committed, and the price would be paid in a blood feud that would outlast them both. Rudolf Dassler arrived at civilian internment enclosure number 29, better known as Hammelburg, stripped of his name, his dignity, and his autonomy. To the American guards, he was merely internee number 1438, a suspected high-ranking Nazi sympathizer who posed a threat to the Allied occupation. But forensically, Hammelburg was not just a prison. It was a petri dish designed to cultivate despair. The conditions were medieval. Thousands of men were crammed into barracks infested with lice, dysentery, and typhus. Rations were meager: watery cabbage soup and a slice of bread that tasted of sawdust. For a man like Rudolf, whose entire psychology was built on vanity and vitality, this environment was a specific form of torture. He was the playboy of Herzogenaurach, a man who wore tailored suits and commanded rooms with his booming voice. Now he was reduced to a skeleton in rags, shivering in the mud. He watched men die of malnutrition around him daily. He watched the once proud officers of the Wehrmacht beg for cigarettes. This rapid physical decomposition stripped away the veneer of civilization. It exposed the raw, animalistic core of the man. In the silence of the barracks, listening to the coughing of the dying, Rudolf's mind did not turn to repentance for his political sins. It turned inward, focusing on the singular cause of his misery. He did not blame Hitler. He did not blame the Americans. He blamed the man he imagined sitting in the warm kitchen of the family villa, drinking wine and counting money, Adolf Dassler. Starvation has a clarifying effect on the brain. It burns away the fog of sentimentality. As Rudolf lay on his bunk, fighting off the lice, he began to perform a forensic reconstruction of the events that led him there. He analyzed the timeline with the precision of a detective. He recalled the bunker incident of 1943. He recalled the Wives' War, but most critically, he analyzed the specific accusations the Americans had levied against him. The interrogators had accused him of working for the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence agency of the SS, and the Gestapo. This was a specific, highly damaging charge. It wasn't a generic accusation of being a party member. It was an accusation of being part of the terror apparatus. Rudolf knew, with absolute certainty, that he had never served in the SD. He was a loudmouth patriot, yes, but not a secret policeman. Where had this information come from? It was too detailed to be random. It implied an intimate knowledge of his movements, twisted into a malicious narrative. He realized that only someone inside the inner circle could have fabricated a lie so tailored to destroy him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Adi, the quiet brother, the one who listened while Rudolf talked. Adi had taken Rudolf's bluster, his drunk talk about secret missions, and weaponized it into a formal denunciation. The Gestapo label was the lock on Rudolf's cage, and Adi held the key. This epiphany transformed Rudolf's hatred from a chaotic emotion into a cold, hard, strategic objective. He was no longer waiting to be released. He was waiting to testify. The Brotherhood was biologically dead. Now it had to be legally executed. Rudolf Dassler decided to weaponize the American bureaucracy against his brother. If Adi wanted to play the game of denunciation, Rudolf would play it better. He requested meetings with the camp interrogators. He sat on the wooden stool, emaciated and trembling, and began to dictate a counter-dossier. This was the moment the Judas dynamic became reciprocal. Rudolf broke the ultimate code of the family. He opened the books on the darker side of the business. He told the Americans that they had arrested the wrong brother. He painted a portrait of Adolf Dassler not as a humble shoemaker, but as the true mastermind of the factory's war effort. He detailed how Adi had personally overseen the production of the Panzerschreck weapons. He described speeches Adi had given to the workforce, rallying them to produce more for the Führer. He mentioned the use of French forced laborers. He claimed that Adi's political passivity was a mask, a clever ruse to hide a deep fanatical commitment to the Nazi cause. This was a scorched earth strategy. Rudolf knew that if the Americans believed him, the factory would be seized, the assets liquidated, and the Dassler legacy destroyed. He was willing to burn the house down to ensure Adi burned with it. This is the logic of mutually assured destruction. Rudolf's psychological state had deteriorated to the point where he valued Adi's ruin more than his own survival. He was sending torpedoes from his sinking ship, hoping to blow a hole in the hull of the villa back home. The American intelligence officers were initially skeptical. They saw a desperate man trying to deflect blame. But Rudolf was persistent. He provided names, dates and details of production quotas. He was essentially acting as a prosecution witness against his own bloodline. The files on the Dassler brothers began to grow thicker. The CIC had to reopen the investigation into Adi. Back in Herzogenaurach, the pressure began to mount. Adi was called in for questioning again. He was confronted with Rudolf's statements. The shoemaker mask began to slip. Adi had to rely on Käthe to navigate this new minefield. They had to scramble to find witnesses, workers, neighbors, anyone who would contradict Rudolf's claims. The war was now being fought via stenographers. Every word Rudolf spoke in Hammelburg was a grenade lobbed into the living room of the villa. Rudolf's time in the camp extended to a year, 12 months of hell, while Adi was rebuilding the business, securing orders for baseball boots, and establishing himself as a pillar of the post-war community. Rudolf was rotting. This temporal disparity is crucial. Adi had a year to rewrite history. Rudolf had a year to stew in it. By the time Rudolf was finally released in July 1946, deemed not a security threat, but still a major offender facing trial, he was unrecognizable. He walked out of Hammelburg with a limp, his eyes sunken, his spirit calcified. He returned to Herzogenaurach not as a prodigal son, but as an avenging ghost. The reunion in the villa upon Rudolf's release was a scene of Gothic horror. He walked through the front door smelling of prison and hate. He saw the prosperity that had returned to the house. He saw Käthe wearing new clothes. He saw Adi sitting at the head of the table. The wives' war resumed instantly, but with a terrifying new intensity. Friedel wept at the sight of her broken husband. Käthe looked at him with cold calculation, knowing that the dangerous variable had returned to the equation. Rudolf did not scream. The time for screaming was over. He simply informed them that the denazification trial, the Spruchkammer, was coming, and he promised them that he would not hold back. He told Adi directly and without emotion that he knew about the betrayal. He knew about the phone call, and he was going to ensure that Adi lost everything just as he had. The prisoner of Hammelburg had been released, but he had brought the prison walls home with him. He was about to turn the denazification court into a gladiatorial arena, where the prize was the factory and the penalty was total social annihilation. By 1946, the war between Adolf and Rudolf Dassler had moved from the private hell of the villa to the public spectacle of the Spruchkammer, the denazification tribunals established by the Allied forces. These were not ordinary legal proceedings. They were inquisitions designed to purge German society of National Socialism, and the penalties ranged from fines to the total confiscation of property and imprisonment. For the Dassler brothers, the tribunal was the final battleground for control of the family empire. It was a zero-sum game. If one brother could prove the other was a major offender, the accused would be stripped of his assets, leaving the survivor as the sole king of the factory. The proceedings in Herzogenaurach became a grotesque theater of fratricide. The townspeople watched in horrified fascination as the two most powerful men in the region took the stand to destroy one another. This was no longer about ideology. It was about liquidation. Rudolf, fresh from the misery of the Hammelburg camp, was the aggressor. He was a man with nothing left to lose. He unleashed a torrent of testimony against Adi, painting his brother as the secret mastermind of the factory's weaponization. He detailed the production of the Panzerschreck rocket launchers. He claimed Adi had voluntarily stopped making shoes to support the war effort. He argued that Adi's quiet demeanor was a mask for a fanatical devotion to the Wehrmacht's victory. Rudolf's strategy was simple. If I go down, he comes with me. He was trying to pull the roof of the factory down upon his brother's head. Adi Dassler, typically introverted and conflict-averse, was forced to defend his life's work. But he did not fight alone. He had Kata. While Rudolf fought with the blunt force of anger, Kata fought with the precision of a surgeon. She understood that the tribunal did not care about the truth as much as it cared about perception. She orchestrated a brilliant, cynical defense strategy that relied on maximizing the contrast between the brothers. Kata mobilized the workforce. This was her masterstroke. She knew that Rudolf was feared by the employees. He was loud, demanding, and imperious. Adi, however, was respected as a craftsman. Kata went from house to house, collecting signed affidavits from the workers. These documents painted a carefully curated picture. Adi was the benevolent protector who kept the workers safe from the draft. Rudolf was the fanatical Nazi speechmaker who threatened them. She found a Jewish supplier who testified that Adi had treated him decently. She found the town's mayor to testify that Adi was apolitical. Rudolf watched helplessly as his own former employees took the stand against him. He saw the loyalty he thought he commanded evaporate. The forensic reality was that Adi had bought their loyalty with bread and stability during the war, while Rudolf had only offered rhetoric. The testimony was devastating. It shifted the tribunal's focus from the actions of the factory to the character of the men. Adi was successfully framed as the good German, caught in a bad system. Rudolf was framed as the bad Nazi who drove the system. The judgment, when it finally came in 1948, was the death knell for the partnership. The tribunal issued a verdict that was surgically asymmetrical. Adolf Dassler was classified as a Mitläufer. This was the second lowest category of offender. It meant he was technically guilty of association, but not of active criminality. He was allowed to retain control of the business, subject to a probationary period and a fine. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, his assets intact. Rudolf Dassler was not so lucky. The weight of the testimony, and perhaps the lingering suspicion from the Judas dossier, resulted in a classification of Belastiter, though later downgraded to Minder Belastiter after exhausting appeals. But the damage was done. For those critical years of Reconstruction, Rudolf was legally marginalized. He was barred from management. He was humiliated. He had to watch as Adi, the follower, legally seized the reins of the company they had built together. To Rudolf, this verdict was proof of a cosmic injustice engineered by his sister-in-law. He believed Adi had manipulated the American judges, just as he had manipulated the family. The legal system had validated the betrayal. The verdict made continued cohabitation impossible. The air in the villa was toxic. The brothers could not breathe the same oxygen. In early 1948, the final decision was made. The company would be split. This was not a corporate restructuring. It was an amputation. They gathered the employees in the factory courtyard and gave them a choice. It was a moment of biblical loyalty testing. Choose your brother. The split fell along the forensic lines of their personalities. The craftsmen, the shoemakers, and the technicians, the people who loved the product, walked to Adi's side. The salesmen, the administrative staff, and the logistics managers, the people who loved the deal, walked to Rudolf's side. It was a cleavage of the company's soul. Adi kept the original factory by the train station. Rudolf took his loyalists and marched across the river Urach to an empty shell of a factory on the other side of town. This was the birth of the town of bent necks. The river became the Iron Curtain of Herzogenaurach. On one side was Adi's new company, registered initially as Adidas and then quickly changed to Adidas. On the other side was Rudolf's company, registered as Ruda, which he soon rebranded to the more athletic Puma. The separation was absolute. The brothers never spoke again. They refused to be in the same room. If they were invited to the same wedding, one would decline. The hatred was institutionalized. It wasn't just two companies, it was two warring tribes, each with its own pubs, its own butchers, and its own football teams. The creation of Adidas and Puma was not a triumph of capitalism. It was a monument to unresolved trauma. The competition that followed was driven by a pathological need to destroy the other. Adi didn't just want to sell shoes. He wanted to bankrupt Rudolf. Rudolf didn't just want market share. He wanted to see Adi humiliated. They spent the next 30 years building global empires fueled by the dark energy of the Judas dossier. Käthe Dassler stood by Adi's side, the victorious queen of the partition. She had saved her husband from prison and secured his legacy, but the cost was the total destruction of the family unit. The parents, Christoph and Paulina, were forced to choose sides. The town of Herzogenaurach became a microcosm of the Cold War, divided by a river of resentment. The denazification guillotine had fallen, severing the bond of blood. The brothers were now free to conquer the world of sports, but they would do so as ghosts, haunted by the memory of the bunker, the betrayal, and the unforgivable sin of survival. The brutal civil war of Adidas versus Puma. By 1948, the forensic map of Herzogenaurach had been redrawn. It was no longer a Bavarian market town. It was a dual-state psychological war zone. The river Aurach, a small, unassuming stream, was transformed into an insurmountable geopolitical border, the Iron Curtain of the footwear industry. To the north of the river lay the fortress of Adolf Dassler, the Adidas factory. To the south lay the stronghold of Rudolf Dassler, the Puma factory. This geographical split was absolute. It was not just a matter of logistics, it was a matter of allegiance. The partition of the brothers necessitated the partition of the population. The townspeople were forced to choose sides not based on skill, but on loyalty. If you worked for Adi, you lived in the north, you drank in the Adidas pubs, and you bought your meat from the Adidas butcher. If you worked for Rudolf, you stayed in the south, frequented the Puma taverns, and bought your bread from the Puma baker. Crossing the river was seen as an act of espionage or treason. The forensic reality of Herzogenaurach in the 1950s was that of a civil war without guns. The social fabric was torn apart by the two factories, which acted as feudal lords, demanding total fealty from their serfs. The brothers had successfully externalized their internal hatred, infecting the entire nervous system of the community. This tribalism gave rise to a unique sociological pathology that earned Herzogenaurach its infamous nickname, the town of bent necks. In any other town in Germany, when two people met on the street, they would look each other in the eye and say, "Guten Tag." In Herzogenaurach, the gaze was inextricably drawn downwards. Before speaking, a citizen would instinctively look at the other person's feet. They were checking the brand. This bent neck reflex was a survival mechanism. It was a forensic IFF system. If an Adidas worker was caught talking to a Puma worker, it could mean termination. If a young man from a Puma family started dating a girl from an Adidas family, it was a scandal akin to Romeo and Juliet, often resulting in disownment. The shoes became the uniform of the faction. To wear the wrong stripes in the wrong pub was to invite a brawl. The brothers had managed to weaponize fashion. They turned leather and rubber into gang colors. The psychological stress of this constant vigilance created a town of paranoid introverts, where every social interaction was preceded by a forensic audit of the footwear. The divide extended beyond commerce into the spiritual and political realms. Forensically, we can see how the brothers aligned themselves with opposing cultural institutions to solidify their power bases. Adi Dassler, the quiet craftsman, aligned Adidas with the local Catholic Church and the conservative CSU party. Adidas was presented as the brand of order, tradition, and technical perfection. Rudolf Dassler, the flamboyant salesman, aligned Puma with the more liberal, working-class ethos, and often the SPD. Puma was the brand of rebellion, speed, and aggression. This alignment meant that even God was drafted into the feud. There were rumors of Puma priests and Adidas priests. The funeral homes were segregated. Even in death, the townspeople were expected to be buried in the soil of their faction. The brothers had achieved a total colonization of daily life. They provided the jobs, they provided the identity, and they provided the enemy. It was a closed loop of loyalty that ensured the war would continue long after the factory whistles blew. The Cold War between the factories was fought with spies. Both Adi and Rudolf were paranoid to the point of clinical obsession. They believed correctly that the other was trying to steal their secrets. The Stammtisch became the front line of industrial espionage. Waitresses were paid to listen to conversations. Disgruntled employees were bribed to smuggle out blueprints or prototypes in their lunchboxes. Rudolf was particularly aggressive in this shadow war. He knew that Adi was the superior innovator, the technical genius. Rudolf's strategy was to infiltrate and copy. He maintained a network of informants on the north side of the river. Adi, in return, turned the Adidas factory into a fortress. He forbade his designers from writing things down, relying on memory and oral tradition to keep secrets from Rudolf. He would test new shoes in the dead of night, running through the forest to avoid Puma binoculars. The atmosphere in the town was thick with suspicion. Every technological breakthrough, the screw-in stud, the nylon sole, was guarded like a nuclear code. The brothers were not just competing for market share, they were competing for the validation of their existence. Every patent Adi filed was a slap in Rudolf's face. Every star athlete Rudolf signed was a knife in Adi's back. The river Aurach flowed silently between them, but it carried the toxic runoff of a brotherhood that had poisoned the well. In the forensic timeline of the Dassler feud, the summer of 1954 stands as the decisive pivot point. West Germany was preparing for the World Cup in Switzerland, a tournament that would serve as the nation's rehabilitation on the global stage. The German national coach, Sepp Herberger, was a pragmatic man who needed equipment. His first stop was not Herzogenaurach North, but Herzogenaurach South. He went to Rudolf Dassler. Herberger and Rudolf had a pre-existing relationship. Puma seemed the logical choice, but Rudolf committed a fatal error of arrogance. When Herberger asked for financial support and a specialized shoe design for the team, Rudolf scoffed. He was a salesman of the old school. He believed that the privilege of wearing Puma was payment enough. He refused to pay the coach or bow to his demands. He viewed the transaction as a favor he was granting, not a partnership he was building. This moment of hubris was the commercial equivalent of suicide. Herberger, insulted and empty-handed, crossed the river Aurach. He went to Adi Dassler. Adi did not scoff. He listened. He saw the forensic opportunity that Rudolf had missed. Adi knew that the World Cup wasn't just a game. It was a global billboard. He opened his workshop to Herberger. He didn't just offer shoes. He offered a technological revolution. He promised Herberger a secret weapon that would neutralize the superior skill of the Hungarian Golden Team. That weapon was the screw-in stud. The screw-in stud was not entirely Adi's invention. Patents existed elsewhere, but he was the one who perfected it for the battlefield of Bern. The concept was simple yet forensically devastating. Standard football boots had fixed leather studs. If it rained, the field became a swamp, and the players became heavy and sluggish. Adi designed a boot with interchangeable studs. If the ground was dry, short studs. If the ground was wet, long spikes. It was adaptable traction. On the day of the final against Hungary, the skies opened up. It was Fritz Walter weather, torrential rain turning the Wankdorf Stadium into a quagmire. The Hungarian superstars, led by Ferenc Puskás, were playing in standard boots. They began to slide. Their movement was compromised by the physics of the mud. In the German locker room, Adi Dassler was on his knees, frantically screwing long metallic spikes into the boots of the German players. He was physically altering the mechanical grip of the team. When the Germans stepped onto the pitch, they had an unfair advantage. They could turn, accelerate, and stop on the slick surface while the Hungarians drifted like ice skaters. Germany won 3-2. The miracle of Bern was hailed as a triumph of the German spirit, but in the Dassler dossier, it was a triumph of the Adidas engineer over the Puma salesman. The aftermath of the match produced an image that would haunt Rudolf Dassler for the rest of his life. The photographs showed the German coach, Sepp Herberger, and the players celebrating. And right there, sitting on the bench next to the coach, was Adolf Dassler. He was not in the stands. He was in the inner sanctum. He was part of the team. The press dubbed him the nation's cobbler. For Rudolf, sitting in his villa south of the river, watching the newsreels, this was a psychological amputation. He realized that he had held the contract in his hand and thrown it away out of pride. He had allowed his introverted, inferior brother to become a national hero. The Adidas brand exploded overnight. It became synonymous with winning. Puma was relegated to the status of the other brand, the shoe of the loser. The rage Rudolf felt was not just professional jealousy. It was the realization that Adi had used Rudolf's own rejection to build an empire. Adi had won the wives' war by proxy. Kata's husband was now the most famous businessman in Germany, while Friedel's husband was just a local factory owner. This humiliation drove Rudolf into a moral abyss. He realized he could not beat Adi on engineering. He could not beat Adi on reputation. So, he decided to change the rules of the game. If he couldn't win the loyalty of the athletes with leather, he would win it with cash. This marked the birth of the Schmiergeld era in sports marketing. Rudolf began to aggressively bribe athletes to wear Puma. Before this, amateurism laws strictly forbade paying players. Rudolf ignored the laws. He sent men with envelopes full of Deutsche Marks to locker rooms. He paid sprinters to wear Puma in the warm-up and then switched to Adidas for the race, creating chaos. He paid Armin Harry, the German sprinter, to betray Adidas. Harry famously wore Pumas in the 100-meter final at the 1960 Olympics, won gold but then laced up Adidas for the medal ceremony, hoping to get paid by both. Adi was furious and banned Harry. Rudolf didn't care about honor. He cared about visibility. The miracle of Bern had hardened Adi's reputation as the saint of sport, which forced Rudolf to become the sinner. To survive the dominance of Adidas, Puma had to become a guerrilla organization, fighting with dirty money and shadow contracts. The town of Herzogenaurach became the epicenter of a global corruption ring. The brothers were no longer just making shoes, they were buying souls. The rivalry had escalated from a manufacturing dispute to a cold war of bribery, where athletes were treated like mercenaries to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. By the late 1960s, the financial attrition of the Dassler feud had reached unsustainable levels. The brothers were engaged in a bidding war that was bleeding both companies dry. Every time a star athlete emerged, be it Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, or Franz Beckenbauer, Adi and Rudolf would descend upon them with briefcases full of cash, driving the price of sponsorship into the stratosphere. They were cannibalizing their own profits to deny the other a victory. This economic madness forced a rare moment of détente in 1970. The subject was Pelé, the Brazilian god of football. Both brothers recognized that Pelé was the nuclear option. To sign him would cost a fortune, potentially bankrupting the winner. The bidding war alone would destroy the market rates for every other player. So in a secret meeting, likely brokered by their sons, Horst and Armin, Adolf and Rudolf agreed to the Pelé Pact. It was a non-aggression treaty. They swore a blood oath that neither company would sign Pelé. They would let him wear a neutral brand or old boots, but they would not touch him. It was the only rational decision they had made in 20 years. It was a ceasefire based on the logic of mutual survival. But forensically, a treaty signed by a Dassler is worthless if it stands in the way of humiliating the brother. The pact held for months, but the temptation was too great for the Puma faction. Rudolf's son, Armin Dassler, was now a driving force in the company, and he had inherited his father's burning need for validation. He saw the Pelé Pact not as a safety measure, but as a shackle. While Adi Dassler respected the agreement, believing that honor still had a place in business, the Puma side began to conspire in the shadows. They dispatched an agent, Hans Henningsen, to the Brazilian training camp in Mexico before the 1970 World Cup. Henningsen was a master of the dark arts of sports marketing. He didn't approach Pelé with a contract initially. He approached him with friendship. He slowly poisoned Pelé against Adidas, implying that the lack of an offer was an insult to his greatness. Then, at the critical moment, Armin Dassler authorized the strike. He shattered the pact. He offered Pelé $120,000 to wear the Puma King boot. But the money came with a specific instruction. They didn't just want him to wear the shoes, they wanted him to weaponize them. They choreographed a moment of marketing theater that would go down in history as the most expensive shoelace tie of all time. The betrayal was executed on live global television. It was the quarterfinal match between Brazil and Peru. The referee blew the whistle for kickoff. The eyes of the world were on the center circle. Pelé, the greatest player on earth, suddenly signaled to the referee. He stopped the game. He knelt down. He had forgotten to tie his shoelaces. The cameras, hungry for every movement of the king, zoomed in. For several agonizing seconds, the screens of millions of viewers were filled with a close-up of Pelé's hands lacing up a pair of boots. The glorious white form strip of Puma was unmistakable against the black leather. It was a commercial ambush of unprecedented audacity. The world saw Puma. Adi Dassler, watching from his home in Herzogenaurach, saw a knife in his heart. He instantly recognized the tactic. It was not an accident. It was a script. Rudolf had broken the pact. He had lied to Adi's face, or at least allowed his son to do the dirty work. The $1 million pause was the final nail in the coffin of their humanity. The fallout from the Pelé betrayal was absolute. Adi Dassler never spoke to Rudolf again, not even through intermediaries. The bridge was burned, and the ashes were salted. But the most significant forensic consequence was the radicalization of the next generation. Horst Dassler, Adi's son, watched the Pelé incident with a cold, terrifying clarity. He realized that his father's code of ethics was a liability. He saw that Rudolf and Armin had won the PR battle by cheating. Horst decided that he would not make the same mistake. He would not just cheat, he would rewrite the rules of corruption. The Pelé Pact betrayal taught Horst that individual athletes were unreliable mercenaries. To truly control the game, you had to own the organizations. You had to own FIFA. You had to own the IOC. The breach of the pact marked the end of the Shoemakers' War and the beginning of the Marketing War. The feud passed from the fathers to the sons. Adi and Rudolf retreated into their villas, dying men consumed by the past, while Horst and Armin stepped onto the global stage, ready to turn the Olympics into a marketplace of bribes and kickbacks. The town of bent necks had produced a generation of monsters who viewed sport not as play, but as a mechanism for revenge, the tragic end of the dynasty. By the autumn of 1974, the biological clock of Rudolf Dassler was winding down, keeping pace with the disintegration of the family bond. The diagnosis was lung cancer, a brutally efficient killer that strikes at the breath itself. Forensically, one could argue that Rudolf had been suffocating for decades, his lungs constricted by the smoke of his own rage and the claustrophobic atmosphere of Herzogenaurach. He lay in a sterile hospital room, a shadow of the bombastic, athletic Puma King who had once charmed Nazi officers and American GIs alike. The cancer had metastasized, spreading through his body with the same aggressive speed that he had tried to apply to his business empire. But as the physical systems failed, the psychological architecture remained rigidly intact. Rudolf was dying as he had lived, in opposition to his brother. For 30 years, his entire existence had been defined by the man across the river. Every shoe he sold, every athlete he bribed, every factory expansion was a kinetic response to Adolf Dassler. Now, facing the terminal silence of the grave, Rudolf found himself in a crisis of legacy. He had built a global brand, yes, but he had lost the war of the bloodline. The miracle of Bern belonged to Adi. The technical reputation belonged to Adi. Rudolf was the salesman, the other brother, the Cain to Adi's Abel. In the quiet delirium of morphine and oxygen deprivation, the walls of his pride began to crack. He reportedly expressed a desire, faint perhaps, but present, to close the circle. He wanted to see the man he had shared a womb with. He wanted to see the man he had shared a bunker with. The intervention came from the spiritual authority of the town. The local priest, aware of the scandal that had poisoned his parish for a generation, decided to make one final attempt at an exorcism of hatred. He visited the bedside of the dying Rudolf. He heard the confession of a man burdened by decades of Schmiergeld and fratricidal warfare. Then the priest crossed the river Orach. He went to the Adidas villa, the fortress where Adi Dassler lived in secluded paranoid luxury. This moment represents the final moral crossroads of the Dassler dossier. The priest sat with Adi and conveyed the message: Rudolf is dying. The end is a matter of hours, not days. He asked for you. This was the opportunity for the Hollywood ending, the tearful reconciliation that redeems a lifetime of sin. The town held its breath, waiting to see if the Mercedes of the Adidas patriarch would cross the bridge to the hospital. But the town underestimated the calcification of Adi Dassler's heart. The Judas dossier of 1945, the memory of Rudolf's testimony in the prison camp, the letters to the Americans, the attempt to strip Adi of his factory, was not a memory to Adi. It was a scar tissue that had hardened into bone. Adi listened to the priest. He sat in his chair, likely looking out at the factory that Rudolf had tried to destroy. And then he delivered his verdict. He refused. He would not go. He told the priest that the betrayal was too deep, the wounds too old. He argued that a deathbed visit would be hypocrisy, a performance for the public rather than a genuine act of forgiveness. Psychologically, this refusal was an act of extreme emotional violence. To deny a dying man his final wish is to sentence him to die alone. Adi chose to let his brother expire without the comfort of absolution. He chose to let the feud outlive the flesh. Rudolf Dassler died on October 27, 1974. He died with his wife Friedel and his son Armin by his side, but the chair for his brother remained empty. The news of his death rippled through Herzogenaurach like a tremor. The Puma side of the town went into mourning. The flags at the southern factory were lowered to half-mast, but all eyes turned north. How would the Adidas side respond? Adi's response was a masterclass in passive-aggressive formality. He did not issue a public eulogy. He did not close the Adidas factory for a day of remembrance. Instead, he sent a wreath. It was a large, expensive arrangement of flowers delivered to the funeral home, but the card attached to it was devastating in its brevity. It did not say, "To my beloved brother." It did not say, "Rest in peace." It contained a generic message of condolence, unsigned by the affectionate nickname Adi, but rather signed with the formal, distant title of the family. Even more chilling was the directive issued to the Adidas staff. While no official memo exists, the oral history of the town of Bent Necks confirms that there was a de facto prohibition on attending the funeral. Adi made it clear that loyalty to Adidas meant ignoring the death of the Puma founder. The funeral of Rudolf Dassler was a segregated event. The mourners were exclusively Puma employees, Rudolf's family, and the faction of the town that lived south of the river. The Adidas employees stayed at their machines. The noise of the stitching in the presses continued without a pause. Adi had decided that the death of his brother was not significant enough to interrupt the production of a single shoe. Why did he do it? Forensic psychology suggests that for Adi Dassler, forgiveness equated to weakness. He was a man of systems, of mechanics, of precise engineering. In his world, a broken part is replaced, not repaired. Rudolf had broken the family unit in 1945. He had become a defective component. To forgive him would be to validate the betrayal. Furthermore, the wives' war was still active. Katha Dassler was still alive, still whispering in Adi's ear, still reminding him of the insults Friedel had hurled in the shared villa 40 years ago. The women had not forgiven, so the men could not forgive. The refusal to attend the funeral was the final victory of the Judas dossier. Adi proved that he was the stronger brother because he was the colder brother. He could withstand the sentimental pressure of death. He could look at the coffin of the man he played with as a child and feel nothing but the satisfaction of survival. But this victory came at a terrible cost. It solidified the social necrosis of the family. It taught the next generation, Horst and Armin, that business transcends blood. It taught them that in the Dassler family, you do not mourn your enemies. You simply outlive them. In the 4 years that followed Rudolf's death, Adi Dassler lived as the sole monarch of Herzogenaurach. But reports from the Adidas villa describe a man increasingly withdrawn. He stopped going to the factory floor as often. He spent hours watching sports on television, analyzing the shoes of the athletes, looking for the form strip of Puma. Even with Rudolf dead, Adi was still competing with him. He was haunted by the ghost across the river. The death of Rudolf did not bring peace, it brought a vacuum. Without his antagonist, Adi lost his definition. The friction that had sharpened his genius was gone. He was like a boxer shadow boxing in an empty ring. The unsent letter, the words of reconciliation that were never spoken, hung over the town like a heavy fog. The townspeople continued to look down at their shoes, continued to segregate in the pubs, continued to honor the hatred of two men who were now separated by the ultimate border. Adi had won the war, but he was left alone in the ruins of the victory. presiding over an empire of leather and rubber that was built on the grave of his own brother. Adolf Adi Dassler survived his brother by 4 years, a period that forensic historians describe not as a victory lap, but as a slow, obsessive decomposition of purpose. Without Rudolf to fight, Adi turned his compulsion inward. He became a ghost in his own factory. He was 77 years old, his body failing, yet he was still consumed by the minutiae of the shoe. He would wander the production lines of Herzogenaurach North, picking up unfinished boots, feeling the leather, criticizing the stitching. He was looking for flaws that only he could see. He was trying to perfect a product that had already conquered the world, driven by a fear that somewhere across the river, the ghost of Rudolf was plotting a comeback. On September 6, 1978, the heart of the nation's cobbler finally stopped. The official cause was heart failure, a mechanical breakdown of the pump. But in the context of the dossier, it was the exhaustion of a man who had spent 60 years in a state of hypervigilance. He died wealthy, celebrated, and surrounded by the trophies of the Miracle of Bern and the Olympics. Yet his death was marked by the same profound isolation that defined his life. He had driven away his brother. He had alienated his sister-in-law. His own son, Horst, was already plotting to dismantle his legacy for profit. Adi died as the king of Adidas, but he died in a fortress of silence, the drawbridge raised against a world he no longer trusted. The final act of the Dassler War was not played out in the boardroom or on the football pitch, but in the municipal cemetery of Herzogenaurach. The burial of Adi Dassler presented a logistical crisis for the town. The cemetery is a finite space, a shared garden of the dead. But the geometry of hate required that the partition of the brothers be maintained even in decomposition. The Dassler family, specifically Kada and the heirs, issued strict instructions regarding the plot. Adi was not to be buried near his parents, Christoph and Paulina, because they were buried near Rudolf. The matriarch had chosen her favorite son, even in death, lying in the soil of the Puma faction. Adi Dassler was buried at the absolute opposite end of the cemetery from Rudolf. The distance between the two graves is the maximum physical separation possible within the perimeter of the walls. It is a forensic statement carved in granite. If you stand at Rudolf's grave, you cannot see Adi's. If you stand at Adi's, you cannot see Rudolf's. They are separated by hundreds of other corpses, by rows of trees, and by a silence that is louder than any shout. The layout of the cemetery was designed to ensure that their souls would never intersect. It is a spatial manifestation of the unsent letter. Even as they rot, they have their backs turned to one another. In the years that followed, the graves became a macabre tourist attraction. Visitors to Herzogenaurach do not come to see the factories. They come to see the hate. They walk the path from one headstone to the other, pacing out the grudge. Adi's grave is adorned with a statue of him holding a shoe, the monk of the last, forever examining his work. Rudolf's grave is simpler, bolder, reflecting the Puma king. This necropolis of feud serves as a permanent scar on the landscape of the town. It prevents healing. For decades, the townspeople continued the ritual of the bent necks, even at funerals. If a Puma worker died, the Adidas workers would not attend, and vice versa. The cemetery became a segregated zone, a mirror of the divided pubs and butcher shops. The brothers had successfully colonized the afterlife. They had turned the neutral ground of death into a partisan battlefield. The soil of Herzogenaurach is chemically identical in every plot, but in the minds of the locals, the earth covering Adi is Adidas territory, and the earth covering Rudolf is Puma territory. With both founders dead, one might have expected the town of bent necks to relax. But hatred has a half-life longer than uranium. The feud had become fossilized. It was no longer about Adi and Rudolf. It was about identity. The employees of Adidas and Puma had spent 30 years defining themselves in opposition to the other. They couldn't simply stop hating because the generals had died. The war had become culture. The geometry of hate extended into the corporate structures. The executives who took over, the gray suits who replaced the visionaries, maintained the rivalry not out of passion, but out of policy. They taught the new recruits the legend of the betrayal. They pointed to the cemetery and told the story of the Judas dossier. The graves served as totems, reminding every employee that the company across the river was not a competitor, but an enemy. The physical distance between the corpses ensured that the psychological distance between the living remained absolute. Adi and Rudolf were dead, but they had left behind a perpetual motion machine of animosity, fueled by the geography of their burial and the silence of the river that still ran between them. If Adolf Dassler was the engineer and Rudolf Dassler was the salesman, then Horst Dassler, Adi's son, was the Prince of Darkness. Born in the crossfire of the Wives' War, Horst was a genetic mutation of the feud. He did not inherit his father's love for leather. He inherited his mother's love for power. He viewed the shoe not as a product, but as a key that unlocked the doors of influence. While Adi was busy perfecting the screw-in stud, Horst was busy perfecting the bribe. In the 1970s and 80s, Horst Dassler established a parallel empire that would eventually overshadow the factory itself. He founded a company called ISL. On paper, it was a marketing firm. Forensically, it was a global money laundering operation for the purchase of sports officials. Horst realized that owning the athletes was inefficient. It was smarter to own the federations. He aggressively courted João Havelange of FIFA and Juan Antonio Samaranch of the IOC. He bought the rights to the World Cup and the Olympics, turning them into corporate billboards for Adidas and Coca-Cola. Horst Dassler invented the modern architecture of sports corruption. He operated in the shadows, a workaholic who slept 4 hours a night and kept a black book of secrets on every powerful man in sports. He was the ultimate product of the Dassler dysfunction, a man who trusted no one, manipulated everyone, and believed that loyalty was a commodity to be bought. Horst's dominance was total, but his biology was fragile. The Dassler curse, the tendency for the men of the family to work themselves into an early grave, struck with vicious timing. In 1987, at the peak of his power, Horst Dassler was diagnosed with cancer. It began in his eyes and metastasized to his stomach. He was 51 years old. His death was the forensic tipping point for the family empire. Horst had centralized all power in his own hands. He had built a labyrinthine system of contracts and alliances that only he understood. When he died on April 9, 1987, the brain of the company was lobotomized. He left behind a vacuum that his sisters and his children could not fill. The Dassler women, Adi's 4 daughters, had been raised in luxury but excluded from the dark arts of the business. They inherited the shares, but they did not inherit the ruthlessness. Without the Prince of Darkness to terrify the competition and bribe the regulators, Adidas began to bleed. Nike and Reebok were rising in the West, nimble predators tearing chunks out of the German giant. The family fell into internal squabbling, repeating the cycle of the 1940s, but this time without the competence to back up the arrogance. By 1990, the situation was terminal. The company was losing money. The town of bent necks was in panic. The heirs of Adolf Dassler, the daughters and grandchildren, made the decision that would have made Adi turn in his grave. They decided to cash out. They did not sell to a German industrialist. They did not sell to a sports rival. They sold the entire legacy to Bernard Tapie, a flamboyant French businessman, politician, and convicted fixer. The transaction was the ultimate liquidation of the Dassler soul. The family sold Adidas for approximately 1.6 billion francs, a pathetic sum for the most iconic brand in sports history. In reality, this was not a sale. It was a looting. The family took the money and ran, abandoning the factory, the workers, and the town that had bled for them for 70 years. They retreated into the anonymity of their trust funds, washing their hands of the leather and the glue. The Puma side of the family followed a similar trajectory, eventually selling their stake to a Swiss conglomerate. Within a few short years, the Dassler family had been completely purged from the footwear industry. The name Dassler ceased to be a corporate power and became merely a historical footnote. The brothers Adolf and Rudolf Dassler spent their entire lives trying to destroy each other. In the end, they succeeded, but the collateral damage was their own legacy. They built two global empires, but they destroyed the family unit in the process. They turned a brother into an enemy, a wife into a conspirator, and a son into a bagman. The town of Herzogenaurach today is reunited. The bent necks have straightened. You can wear Pumas in an Adidas pub without fear of a brawl. The river Aurach flows quietly past the headquarters of two multinational corporations that are now owned by faceless shareholders and run by professional CEOs. But if you walk to the cemetery, the geometry of hate remains. The graves are still separated. The silence between the brothers is still absolute. They lie in the ground, stubborn to the end, permanent monuments to the terrifying power of human resentment. They proved that hate is a more powerful fuel than love, but it burns the engine out before the race is won. The shoes conquered the world, but the family lost its soul in the bunker of 1943.